So thank you for the opportunity to offer a provocation today. I've been involved in this interdisciplinary collaboration with Lucy, Liz, Ramya and others since its inception. So it's wonderful for us to have the opportunity through this AHRC workshop to open up that conversation. So the intention of the design around the 3 provocations was that we would have somebody who reflected design research, somebody from a public policy background, and somebody who was a policymaker. So I'm here, I suppose, as the kind of political scientist in the room. I worked on public policy, and my first engagement around design research was thinking about co-production, which I think resonates with some of the ideas that Andrew talked about multidisciplinary, bringing different kinds of expertise into the policy process, and also thinking about questions around the democratisation of the policy process. In speaking today on the theme of the tension and potentials of design research for public policy, I wanted to use the distinction between politics and the political to frame my provocation. So through this collaboration, I've realised that a lot of the debate around, or the perceived potential for design for public policy, lies in this claim to bring forward the political to a policy process that is often seen to be dominated by politics. And that this is an appeal that seems to be shared by design researchers, by political scientists and by policymakers. And so by the political, what I mean by that is to see the policy process more as a space for contestation and agonistic engagement, and to bring the political to a policy process that is often understood by people to be colonised by politics. And what I mean by that is the idea that policy is often reduced to path dependencies, a technocratic set of choices that operate or exist within a given framework of assumptions. So in the provocations today, what I wanted to do was to try and unpack the appeal of this political, why I align design research with the political, and then offer a framework for thinking about the relationship between the political and politics of design for policy. So as this network reflects, the notion of design for policy seems to be having a particular moment, which that sort of overnight success idea probably rallies against the idea of people who've been working on this for years. But nonetheless, the enthusiasm and attendance, I think, for this network speaks to the idea that this is something that is having a moment. And so what is it that kind of constitutes this appeal? Why are we talking about design for policy now? And I would argue that partly that's due to the context that we find ourselves in, and one which I would describe as being value-loaded. So at the moment we have intense political polarisation, the reopening or re-emergence of debates that are on fundamentals from truth to democracy. It's a context of radical uncertainty, a sense that it is becoming more difficult to anticipate events, predict how they will unfold. The pandemic and the climate emergency are obvious examples of that. There's a plurality of legitimate views on how to proceed. So both in the sense of acknowledging that different kinds of expertise are needed to respond to complex problems, but also the idea that there isn't an obvious solution, and that tried and tested forms of policy design might not be capable or useful in responding to the kinds of issues that are faced now. And then finally, I think the context is one where the stakes are high and there's a real sense of a need for urgency to act. So on the one hand, we require different kinds of policy, problem-solving tools to give us foresight, to anticipate futures in a context of uncertainty. But also, this context seems to reveal the limits of our existing politics, of our existing policy-making processes to meet the moment. And so instead, there's this appeal to look towards the political, to think about not only shaping the world that exists, but bringing new worlds into being, to open up possibilities rather than being constrained by the limits of the possible. So why this association between design? Why is design a response to this look towards, or urge to move towards, to bring the political into policy process? So in our last workshop, Professor Anne Light spoke really powerfully about the potential for design and creative practice to move us towards more sustainable futures. And I found appeal in what I would perceive as her kind of refusal to sort of accommodate or be constrained by existing realities. And what she instead was interested in was about exposing and interrogating the ontological assumptions of policymaking, and in doing so, destabilising and subverting those norms in order to open up more radical possibilities. And what I really appreciated within this provocation, within Professor Light's provocation, and more broadly within design research, is this sense of an inherently hopeful endeavour, that design is an inherently hopeful endeavour, which for somewhat cynical political scientists is both problematic and appealing at the same time. And what it seems to offer is the idea that policy making can be more than what Durose has termed a fuzzy gamble or seats of the pants kind of intuitions. So next, I want to draw on my previous work to think about how we might understand this potential thinking for the policy process in a way that benefits public servants and those they work with and those they serve. And so there are three different approaches that think differently about the relationship between politics and the political within design policy. So the first one is perhaps closer to Carl's provocation earlier, and I would refer to this as more of an emergent design, which is really seeking to meet the aspiration that I've already talked about bringing the political into the policy space. And this is where thinking about how the strengths of design thinking could be used to enable anticipatory governance. So that could be about the role of design in materialising uncertainty and ambiguity, opportunities to exploit that ambiguity, scope to introduce dissenters, to capitalise on moments of agonism, to contribute to the visualisation and materialisation of complexity at different scales, and open up opportunities for us to experience future policy imaginaries. And so the question here then becomes, so what are the moments, the opportunities, the entry points for design thinking to inform the policy process in this way? When is it, or what is it, that punctuates these moments of consensus or stability in policy directions? The second approach is perhaps a more instrumental one, and from this perspective, design was a means of policy making simply to resist the default to closing down options. So reducing prerogative to different forms of expertise, to challenging past dependencies. And instead, design can help materialise perceptions, bringing in, for example, a focus on people's experience of policy decisions, offering the source of creative disruption. However, in this context, design principles are also at risk of depoliticisation and being used as a set of tools to be picked up and put down without systemic or holistic transformation, and so inhibiting the critical value of design for policy. And so the question for this approach, for an instrumental approach, becomes how do we better understand the challenges that the policy process presents for the introduction of design thinking? And the final approach is one that you might term more as pragmatic, and this acknowledges, as Professor Paul Kearney did in our first workshop, that the policy process is necessarily contingent and messy, which can mean a tendency towards an haphazard layering of policies in a way that only allows incremental change to occur rather than systemic or holistic change. However, within such a messy process, there are spaces for design, and design might provide practical means for test and learning cheaply, quickly, collaboratively, alongside other forms of experimentation and innovation. And this pragmatic approach itself is an argument for design interventions to best shape the processes that are already taking place, going with the grain of what exists. And so the question here becomes, how can design practice and research be articulated in a way that resonates with policymakers? And so the framework that I've offered isn't a set of mutually discrete alternatives. It's a way to help us think through the untapped potential, and these ideas might already be present coterminously within the policy process. I'd argue that engaging with them involves engaging with and understanding both design research, the policy process itself, and so that consolidates the value of the sort of interdisciplinary and collaborative kind of approach that, that this network represents. And I wanted to just make two final comments to conclude.
So one borrows from Paul Kearney's exhortation in the last workshop, which is that to bring forward the political without abandoning the politics sometimes demands for us to do things that Herbert Simon would call satisfying, recognising the value of being good enough. That isn't the same as abandoning some of the perhaps idealism of design and search, but more recognising the different ways in which change and the potential of design can be realised in a deeply entrenched process. And one final point that was made by a policymaker who came along to the panel organised, that Lucy, Liz, Rami and I organised at the Design Research Society in Bilbao earlier this year, was that sometimes there's a danger of these debates, and I feel particularly conscious of this ahead, after following Andrew's provocation, that the danger of these debates adopting the saviorism that overstates both the distinctiveness or radicalism of design and underplays actually what policymakers are already doing and how sophisticated and thoughtful they are about their engagement with the policy and critical they are about their engagement with the policy process. And so the challenge then becomes, as acknowledging the question that I posed today, how to communicate across different disciplines and across research and practice in a way that values the different kinds of insights that each can bring to the challenges of policy work.